Public opinion polls play an important part in American politics. They are eternally entwined with the electioneering process as well as linkage institutions such as the mass media or interest groups, among other elements of government, because they allow policymakers or policy shapers to gauge public opinion. Public opinion polling is a relatively new science. It was pioneered by George Gallup, who hoped to positively influence democracy through polls. The firm that he founded spread throughout the democratic world, so much so that the word Gallup actually means opinion poll in some languages. Since it would be prohibitively expensive and time-consuming to ask every citizen his or her opinion on a whole range of issues, polls rely on a sample of a population in order to gauge the population's public opinion on a certain matter. Much like a doctor does not need to drain a gallon of blood to test for disease, policymakers do not need to conduct a census to determine public opinion. There are many diverse types of polls, but the ones that we deal with in GOV are mainly straw polls, meaning that they are unscientific and meant only to assess public opinion. One type of poll that should be recognized, however, is the exit poll, which is used extensively by the media in order to try and predict who electoral winners will be. Fox News and CNN are two cable news networks in particular who love to use exit polls. Similarly, interest groups may use push polls to try to dissuade the public from voting for a certain candidate. Tracking polls, on the other hand, are used to predict candidates' long-term election chances. So how should polls be created? Well, they should be created with the goal of being representative in mind. In order to be representative, a poll should have a reasonable size and an element of randomness to it. For most polls, the ideal sample size is 1,000 to 1,500 people, and the technique that pollsters use to make a sample representative is random sampling, where essentially every member of a population has an equal chance of being in the sample. One famous example of an unrepresentative poll was a 1936 Literary Digest poll which erroneously predicted Alf M. Landon to be the victor of the 1936 elections. While they had admittedly polled a large sample of 2 million people, their sample was not representative of the whole, as they failed to pick up the middle-class preference for FDR, and when FDR did win the election, the Literary Digest became a laughingstock and soon went out of business. Since obtaining a representative sample is not always an easy process, there are often many problems with polls. These problems are mostly related to bias, created when people do not respond to polls, respond in the way that they believe society would desire them to respond, or when polls fail to pick up a major part of the population, such as the Literary Digest poll did. Bias can also be created intentionally through wording of questions, which leads people to pick certain answers that pollsters want them to pick. One controversial problem with polls is the bandwagon effect, which argues that polls, and especially exit polls, lead people to vote for whatever is most popular, although there is no conclusive proof that this actually affects people's voting behaviors. Proponents of polls argue that polls are valuable tools for democracy because they provide valuable information about public opinion, which allows policymakers to keep in touch with changing opinions on issues so that they can quickly and efficiently modify policy to better serve their constituency. Opponents of polls, however, claim that polls actually discourage poll leadership because they make politicians more concerned with following than leading. After all, what if polls had told Constitutional Convention delegates that a constitution was unpopular, Jefferson that the Louisiana Purchase was necessary, or William Seward that buying Alaska was foolhardy? This argument essentially boils down to who should guide who. Should the people guide the government, or should the government guide the people? Recent research by political scientists also argues that polls may be both good and bad. In other words, politicians gather information from polls that allows them to pander to the people so they can get support on the legislation that both they and their constituency wants. So it's a compromise down the middle. Overall, whether polls are good, bad, or both depends simply on how well they're conducted and how thoughtfully they're interpreted. Regardless of their effect on the policy-making process, though, polls continue to be one of the most efficient ways to determine public opinion and probably will continue being so for a long time. Finally, it wouldn't be a presentation about polling without describing some of the recent trends that polling has actually found in relation to GOV. And these findings are kind of disconcerting. So basically the first is that Americans are not well informed about politics, which raises the question of how much should policymakers let themselves be influenced by popular opinion when the population is so ill-informed. And the second is that Americans are increasingly dissatisfied with the government, which essentially raises a debate of, does a healthy dose of cynicism keep politicians on their toes, or does distrust of the government show that the democratic system is failing? Which is a very foreboding thought.